Welcome to another class in our exciting series and Return to Zion. And right now, what we're talking about in our last two classes and in this class are kind of visions of the redemption. How the people during the Return to Zion, as reflected in their books, how they saw the age of the redemption, you could say, like the Messianic age. And we noted, and I just like to remind you once again, that of course, when I say Messianic age, I'm using kind of a shorthand because the Messianic age during this time does not necessarily feature a Messiah. It can simply be God saving the people of Israel. And there are absolutely accounts that don't seem to focus on any human being who's leading the redemption. Rather, it's God who is bringing plenty to his people or saving his people. So what we saw two classes ago, we were looking more at kind of the natural visions of the redemption. And we noticed how there, on the one hand, you have visions of simply a return, even though it's kind of divine return. These kind of more natural redemptions, they're not supposed to be any less divine. I don't mean by saying natural that it doesn't have that it's not being presented as an intervention, a divine intervention, and that's from God, but it's simply a type of age where the focus is on peace and plenty, not in some kind of apocalyptic, unnatural battle or time, etc. So in our first class in this series of what's turned into three classes, we looked at several accounts of simply God bringing everyone back, or the classic account in Zechariah and Zechariah of old people and young people in the squares of Jerusalem, old people with their canes, children playing. And we talked about how this representation, which is presented as if it's almost impossible for the people listening to believe that we are going to get to that point. And the reason why it's so hard to believe is, first of all, in the time of Zechariah, Jerusalem is not built. Jerusalem is not secure. It's a time of tremendous deprivation. People are having a very hard time eking a life out of the land. It's been very difficult for them, and they don't have extra food. To imagine a time when you will be able to easily support both old people and little children who cannot themselves work and contribute to food growing, etc., but you are able to support them and they're living. The children, remember that at one time, infant mortality was very, very high. And so, of course, elderly, the idea of being able to live to an old age, that requires health and peace and food. So the idea that we would have these people that we'd be able to support both the elderly and children was amazing. And this was a future devoutly to be wished and hoped for, right? And that's how we have that account in Zechariah. And yet in the very same books that we have these more naturalistic accounts, we have accounts that are talking more in terms of an apocalyptic battle. And Zechariah is a prime example of this. And so what we saw in our last class, when we just took kind of a deep dive into the apocalyptic vision at the end of Zechariah, at the end of Zechariah, where we had this tremendously difficult, harsh battle, a battle around Jerusalem, a siege of Jerusalem, and then a conquest of Jerusalem itself, where half the people are sent into exile, where women are raped, where horrible things happen. And then there's a split in the Mount of Olives. The geography of the city itself and the surrounding area changes, right? With a new valley, a new river, and in final analysis, the victory, right, of the divinely given victory of Israel because I would just say Israel. Everyone at this point is kind of thinking of Judah as Israel, right? Of Israel, of the nation of Israel, and really not so much, partly through battle, but also partly through God simply kind of destroying the other nations that have gone to battle with them. And then the aftermath is that everyone will recognize God's divine kingship, and that all the nations are going to come and worship God appropriately on Sukkot in order so that they will get rain, right? Whereas Egypt is going to do it in order to not get a plague, because Egypt doesn't need rain because they have the Nile, right? So that vision in Zechariah, we discussed, and the question is, well, why would you want to believe in something like that? Why would you want to say there's something like that? Partly because if you do get, and we've seen this in modern times, you get to a point where, okay, this is it. We have old people and children in Jerusalem. And then the question is this it? And now sometimes the answer is sure, this is it. So as I've mentioned before, if you read the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, then you absolutely will come out with the idea that this is perfectly fine. It is perfectly fine to have Judea as a province within the Persian Empire. We have to have kind of semi-autonomy with our temple functioning and our capital city, very important, and Jerusalem built. And we don't need a central messianic figure. It's perfectly fine to have a ruler who's then switched for another ruler, as have a governor that's switched with another governor when the time comes. That's all perfectly fine. And this was the promise. But we can also understand people who are like, wait, is this really the promise? Weren't we promised more than this? Wasn't there supposed to be something bigger? Not just kind of just living, just regular life, but a time when everything has changed. Everyone recognizes God, nature itself, where the hierarchy of nations has changed. Isn't that what we were promised? So that there's that idea as well. And we talked about in our last class, we talked about the concept of the Yom Hashem, the day of the Lord. And that's a concept that we have throughout earlier prophecies, the idea that what is going to happen to bring in the final age is this tremendous battle between the nation of Israel and all the other nations, or a day of judgment, right? It doesn't have to be a day of battle. It could be a day of judgment, but again, involving Israel and all the other nations. And that is when God is going to directly intervene, and there are going to be wonders. And that's what we saw at the end of the book of Zechariah, where we had a day that was not day or night, where miraculous things were happening. So in this class, we're going to look at some other sources like that, and we're going to compare it with some earlier sources as well. I see that there are some chats. Let me take a look at that. So Yafa asks, when did the concept of an actual person, maybe with a white donkey, become accepted? We have this idea of a person, putting the white donkey on the side, but we have an idea of a person early on, because there is this idea of the Chotem Geze Yishai, the person who's going to come out of the Davidic line, right? That we're going to have a ruler, a leader from the Davidic line who is going to restore the Davidic line and Davidic rule, and that he is going to lead the kingdom forward, right? And what's interesting is if we think about the Second Temple period and this whole kind of importance of these lines of people. So the idea that you want to have a ruler from the Davidic line, if you recall, let's think back to the beginning of our series, we had the idea that Zerubbabel, right? Zerubbabel is coming from the Davidic line, and therefore he should be the Messianic ruler, right? And we saw that idea strongly in Haggai and Zechariah, this hope for Zerubbabel essentially being a Messianic figure, right? Essentially being the one who's going to bring in this kind of divine redemption. At the same time, we also have, rather not at the same time, what's interesting is, of course, that is, if we look at the history of reactions to the Hasmonean rule, because if you recall, Hasmonean kings were, of course, not from the Davidic line at all. On the contrary, they were Kohanim, they were priests. So it's keeping with this idea of the Davidic line. Chazal, the rabbis, their problem with the Hasmoneans was that they shouldn't have taken the kingship, right? They shouldn't have taken royal rule. They should have stayed priests. Well, if you look at, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, their problem is more that they're priests. You want to rule, go ahead, but you should not be priests. People of the Tzadokite line should be priests, right? Or high priests. They can be priests, but they can't be high priests, which of course they were. So they each had their problems. But if we look at Chazal, we look at the rabbis and say, why do they have such a problem with them taking rule? They say it's because you're already priests. You can't also take the crown of kingship. But also, of course, part of it is this idea that who should be the Messianic kings? They should be from the Davidic line. And that, again, is still coming back to the idea of the Messiah. If you remember, what does Messiah mean? It means anointed, right? Which, of course, is also what Christ means, by the way. It means anointed, right? So Christos, I should say, right? That just means it's a translation of Mashiach, the anointed one. And the anointed one is the king and the high priest. Those are the two people who get anointed. So when we say Messiah, we're really talking about a king. So let's go into our text unless there are any other comments.
Miriam,
Yes.
do scholars and Bible critics think that Zechariah was edited sometime in the Hasmonean period, the way Sefer Daniel was edited?
Well, they think the last piece, the piece that we read last time, they think it's from later. They call it Deutero-Zechariah, right? So they don't think that it was composed at the same time as the main book of Zechariah. And that actually makes sense because, as we noted, in the main book of Zechariah, Jerusalem is not built. Remember, it's very early on in the return to Zion. And so it doesn't make sense the way that the apocalyptic battle is described in Zechariah, where it's Judah against Jerusalem, speaking of Jerusalem very much as a city with its own population that's distinct from the rest of Judea, that has its own walls, where it's a big deal to put it under siege. That doesn't match the reality of the actual prophet Zechariah we're familiar with and when he lived. So it makes sense that that end of the book would actually be from later. Which would, of course, again, mean that it would be edited later because it would be added later.
I would imagine there are all kinds of people commenting on how utterly relevant Zechariah, both the naturalistic end and the apocalyptic end, are chillingly relevant to the 20th and 21st centuries.
Oh, look, when I was like in high school, I mean, like I who actually opened Zechariah, but we all knew about the city, half of it going into exile and the city being split, and everyone connected it to 48. Everyone connected to 1948 when the people in the old city were taken to Jordan, right? Where the city was split with a wall in the middle, as we all know. You had East and West Jerusalem, and we think of that as a split. And of course, Zechariah talks about a split from east to west, but it means from east to west, splitting the city to north and south. There's a line that goes east to west, splits it north and south. That's what it's talking about in Zechariah. But certainly that, plus the hope of having children and old people in the squares of Jerusalem, that was always considered very relevant. At the same time, it's very possible, and I think we discussed this last time, that it's also reflecting what the Babylonian exile was like. Because in the Babylonian exile, you had part of the population exiled while part of the population stayed in Jerusalem. And it could be that that's what it was reflecting. We don't know about the rapes that it mentions in Zechariah. Was that also part of the Babylonian exile? We don't know.
What I was thinking is that less than 100 years ago, people in the Jewish community of Jerusalem, the deprivation was so great that you take a renowned Rebbe like Reb Aryeh Levine, one of his children literally starves to death. And who would have thought in those days that you'd be living in a prosperous city with old people and children and all in a span of a few decades?
I agree. It's a really good point. I was on a tour of the old Yishuv. It was actually a tour of Yiddish in the old Yishuv, which was very interesting. And they had something like old Yishuv. We're talking about really old. We're talking about, I don't want to say the year because I'll get it wrong, but way before the state was a glimmer in anyone's eye. It was, and they had something crazy like an 80% infant mortality rate, something absolutely insane. You're like, how did anyone live this way? Like literally like an 80%, like it just crazy. And so it's true, this idea that not that long ago, people would never have thought you could have this kind of prosperity. And yet, you'll still see. So today you'll have people be like, but there's got to be more, right? There's got to be more. One of the explanations, actually, pretty sure that it was Al Baumgarten who wrote about this, that one of the explanations of what happened in 67 after the conquest of the reunification of Jerusalem and the bringing back of so much of what we used to was traditionally Israel, there was a tremendous rise in Messianic fervor. And one of the theories of that rise was that Now everything's supposed to be different. We did this. Now we've reunited Jerusalem. Now we have it. Now this should be the Messianic age. And then when the Messianic age doesn't happen, there's a disappointment, right? Why hasn't this happened? So at the same time, when we see once there is perhaps, once the city of Jerusalem is built, and once people are living in Jerusalem and in Judea, and there's more of a normal life, not everyone still has it easy, but there's more of a normal life. Is this it? Is this it? And then it makes sense that then we would see the end of Zechariah, with this kind of vision of an apocalyptic battle. Why it's so horrendous that's a good question, because it's a really horrible thing that you're expecting people to live through before the final, kind of divine age. But the idea is, and we're going to see this a little bit more today as well, and we're in this age, we start seeing these battles, and this Messianic age is a time to really separate between the wicked and the righteous. And the wicked are really going to get in, and the righteous are going to get saved. And as opposed to a lot of earlier prophecies, when these apocalyptic battles, people were going to die, and you couldn't be sure that if you were righteous, you were going to escape unscathed. There's more of an idea at this point that, yes, if you're righteous, you should be able to get through it.
But
any other questions before I go back in?
When you go to the apocalyptic vision, it brings up scary images of October 7th and the international aftermath.
As you know, when we were doing Ezekiel, when we were doing Ezekiel, the Gog, the description of Gog and what happens there, to me, was very reminiscent of October 7th, because what was described there, specifically Gog attacks when the people of Israel are in their homes safe. They feel safe. And they have no walls because they feel safe. And it seems to be a time of plenty. It seems to be after the redemption. Specifically, this is after everyone's back. Everyone feels safe. And that's when he attacks with his numerous mercenaries from different nations. The difference in that account is that battle is fought completely by God. Essentially, there is no battle fought by Israel or Judah. These attacking armies come, and God simply destroys them through various means. And then what's left for the Jews to do is bury a lot of bodies and use all the spears for firewood. It's not their own bodies, the enemy bodies. They have a lot of enemy bodies that they all have to clear up to purify the land. Okay, so let's jump in to our text. We're going to take a look at Malachi. This, again, is kind of a day of the Lord, right, that we're going to see in Malachi. Again, drawing from that same tradition that we have from earlier prophecies. The lead-in is people who are doubting God. So God's like, your words are too hard for me. And they say, why? What have we said? They say, why bother serving God? Right? What have we gained by doing what he wanted us to do? By keeping his charge actually sounds more like, doing things for the temple and walking in fear of God. What have we gained from it? They're like, hey, wicked people are doing well. Okay? The wicked people are happy. The people who do wickedness, they've built up their wealth, and they've tested God and escaped. I'm in Malachi Gimel. That's Malachi 3. Malachi Gimel, I read from Pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13. So, Az nidberu yirei Adonai ish al re'ehu v'yakshev Adonai v'yishma v'yikatev sefer zikaron lefanav li'rei Adonai ulchoshvei shmo. So then people who do fear God have spoken to each other, and God listened, and he wrote it in a book of remembrance. Why? Because God's going to give each person their due. So what did the fearers of God say to each other? It sounds like they're actually saying to each other, this is what they're saying to each other. They're saying to each other, hey, The wicked seem to be doing pretty well. We fear God, but it looks like the wicked are doing pretty well. And this is the perfect segue to this kind of apocalyptic end. It's going to punish the wicked and in the final analysis reward the righteous. This is very much a product of this time where it's very clear, not just that there's an apocalyptic battle or an apocalyptic age, but that part of the function of this age is to separate the wicked and the righteous. And it's going to be even more developed in what we call Second Temple literature that's created outside of the Hebrew Bible, as it were. So God writes it in a book. Vayuli amar Adonai tzvaot layom asher ani oseh sgula v'chamalti alehem kasher yachmol ish al beno ha'oved oto. Okay, and because I'm preparing for a day when they're going to be my treasured possession, and I'm going to my sgula, right, my treasure, I'm going to be tender toward them the way a person is tender to his son who serves him. This is the combination of Israel as the son of God and Israel as the servant of God, right? Or v'shavtem uritem ben tzadik lirasha ben oved Elohim lasher lo avado. And you will return and you will see the difference between a righteous person and a wicked person, between someone who serves God and someone who doesn't serve God. Why? Because the day is coming when these people are going to get their judgment. Ki hinei hayom ba bo'er katanor v'yu chol zedim v'chol oseh rish'a kash v'lihatotam hayom haba amar Adonai tzvaot asher lo yazov lahem shoresh v'anaf. Because the day is coming burning like a furnace, and all of the arrogant sinners and everyone who does evil will be straw, and on that day they'll be burnt. They won't have a root or branch left. So they're going to be burnt completely, and that is the point of the day of the Lord. Now, I want to say something about the day of the Lord. It is traditionally a day of judgment, also in earlier prophecies, but it's a day of judgment usually between nations. And now, at this point, it's a day of judgment between the wicked and righteous of Israel. But those people who fear my name are going to, the sun of righteousness, the sun of vindication will shine on them, will shine on you rather. And it will bring healing in its wings, and you will go out and you will you will frolic, right? Like well-fed calves. Vasotem risha'im ki yu efer tachat kapot raglechem bayom asher ani oseh amar Adonai tzvaot. And on the day that I am creating, you are going to trample the wicked people to dust under your feet. That is the day of the Lord in Malachi. It's actually very different than the traditional day of the Lord. We're not talking about nations here. We're talking about a day that's going to divide the wicked and the righteous. And that's the beginning of what's going to become part of a major force in apocalyptic literature in the Second Temple period. And let's finish. Zechru Torat Moshe Avdi asher tziviti oto b'chorev al kol Yisrael chukim u'mishpatim. Remember the Torah of Moshe that I commanded him in Chorev with laws. Hinei anochi sholech lechem et Eliyahu Navi lifnei bo yom Adonai Hagadol v'ano. I'm going to send you Eliyahu before the final great day. Zakovitz always likes to talk about how Moshe and Eliyahu are mirrors of each other, are linked. And here we see it. It's reminding us of the Torah of Moshe. And then the next thing is I'm sending you Eliyahu before the day of this awesome day of the Lord. Ve'shiv lev avot al banim v'lev banim al avotam pen avo v'keti et aretz cherem. And he's going to reconcile between fathers and sons and fathers, lest I kill everyone. So what is this talking about? This is actually talking about, this is a theme that we also see in Jubilees. It's certainly a theme that we see in the animal apocalypse in Enoch. This idea that of a generational divide. The sons are like, you guys are doing things all wrong. You guys are not doing what you should be doing. And there are these divides. And who's going to solve it? It's going to be Eliyahu, right? Eliyahu is going to come back and solve it because after all, Eliyahu never died. So he can come back and fix it. And that will keep everyone righteous and prevent God from just destroying everyone. So here we see a kind of evolution of what we call the day of the Lord. but it's still a time when some people are destroyed and some people kind of win. Any questions before we go kind of dive into Yeshayahu, into Isaiah? Okay, so let's go. Now I'm going to be reading from Yeshayahu Samech Hey, Isaiah 65. Here, there's going to be kind of a mix of the same idea in terms of who kind of wins and who doesn't. We'll do it from the beginning. Yeah, I'm doing it from the beginning of chapter 65 of Parak Samech Hey. Okay. Nidrashti lelo sha'alu, nimseti lelo vikshuni, amarti hineni el goy lo kara bishmi. God's like, I was there. I was there and you weren't asking for me. I was responding, you weren't asking. I was there, you didn't seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that did not call my name. Perasti yadai kol hayom el am sorer, haochim haderech lo tov achar machshavotehem. I spread out my hands all day to a rebellious nation that went on the wrong path after their own thoughts and plans. Am hamachisim oti al panai tamid, zovchim baganot umekatrim al halevenim. This nation that is constantly making me angry, that is sacrificing in gardens and bringing incense on bricks. In other words, they are sacrificing in foreign worship. Hayoshvim bakvarim. Uvanitzurim yalinu, haochlim besar hachazir umarak pigulim klehem. They sit in tombs. They sleep in secret, in enclosed places. Again, this is also clearly a type of probably ancestor worship of the ancestors or of the dead. They eat pig. They put soup of also unclean animals in their bowls. Haomrim krav elecha al tigashbi. They're saying, don't come close to me. This is they're saying essentially it seems to be God. They're saying to God, don't come close, right? Don't come close to me. This makes smoke in my nose. This makes me angry, right? And with a burning fire all day. Hinek tuva lefanai. Again, we have the theme of things being written before God. We had that theme now in Malachi. We have that theme in Daniel, right? The idea, Daniel, that things are written in a book before God. This is a relatively late idea in the biblical books. This is kind of of this period, right? It's of the Shivat Zion Second Temple period. The idea that things are written in a book before God, that God records things in a book, right? Behold, it is written before me. Lo echeshek ki im shilamti v'shilamti al chekam, right? I'm not going to keep myself back. I'm going to pay them for what they did on their bosoms, on their own bodies. They're going to pay. Avonotechem v'avonot avotechem yachdav. Amar Adonai asher kitru al haharim v'al hagvaot cherfuni umadoti fulatam rishona el chekam. Right? Your sins, and the sins of your forefathers together, says God, that they brought incense on mountains, right? And on hills, and they kind of insulted me on hills because through their idol worship. And I will make an account of their actions, and I'm going to make them pay. On their bosoms means they themselves are going to pay. Okay, but the same way when you find some decent grapes in the cluster and you say, don't destroy it because there's blessing in it. There's some good grapes in the cluster. That's what I'm going to do for my servants. I'm not going to destroy everyone. Votzeti mi'Yaakov zera u'miYehuda yoresh harai v'Yeshua b'chirai v'avadai yishkenu shama. I am going to still find seed from Yaakov and an inheritor from Yehuda, someone to inherit my mountains. And my chosen ones are going to inherit, and my servants are going to dwell there. In other words, a lot of people are going to die because they're idol worshipers, but I am going to save the righteous. The people who sought me out, they're going to have a place for their cattle and their flocks. Vatem ozvei Adonai, hashchechem et har kodshi, haorchim lagad shulchan, v'amimalim lamanim misach. You sinners who leave God, who ignore my holy mountain. In other words, you ignore Zion, right? But you set a table for God. God is the God of luck, right? And you also fill a bowl for Mani, who's the God of destiny. So these are idol worship. It's translating here luck and destiny, but these are gods, right? Right. So I have appointed you for the sword. You are already set aside for the sword. You are all going to be slaughtered because I called you and you didn't answer. I spoke and you didn't hear. You did the evil things in my eyes, and what I wanted you did not choose. לכן כה אמר אדוני אלוהים, הנה עבדי יאכלו ואתם תרעבו, הנה עבדי ישתו ואתם תצמאו, הנה עבדי ישמחו ואתם תבושו. So God says, my servants will eat, you will starve. My servants will drink, you will be thirsty. My servants will be joyful, and you will be ashamed. Again, this idea, I'll finish this umisheva ruach tiye lilu. My servants will cry out in joy from having a goodness at heart, because they'll have all the good things. You will scream from the pain of your heart and you will howl from a broken spirit. V'nachtem shimchem l'shvu'a l'bchirai v'mitcha Adonai Elohim v'la'avadav yikra shem acher. So you're going to leave, your name is going to be a curse for my chosen ones, that God will kill you, and his servants will be given a different name. Before this, if you looked at Amos, you look at Hosea, when they're talking about bad things coming, they don't say, and the righteous people are all going to be saved, because righteous people aren't all going to be saved, because when a bad thing happens, everyone knows that everyone gets hurt. If people are sinning and the city is conquered, that means the righteous people in it are also going to suffer. It's only when we get to Yechezkel, who's talking after the Babylonian exile, that we have this idea brought forward that you can have only that the righteous people will save just themselves, and they will somehow be able to be saved, where everything else goes to hell, right? And the reason, and my theory, and I'm sure other people have this theory as well, my theory is that the reason you have this starting with Yechezkel, because when only starting with Yechezkel do you have the nation having gone through an exile, where you have an exilic community with one destiny and a non-exilic community with another destiny, where they both see themselves as part of the same nation. They're very much part, in a way, of the same collective, and yet they have different fates. Once you see that that's a possibility, that you can have different fates and yet be part of the same group, you can start talking about, well, why can't God just punish the wicked and not everyone? Whereas before, in biblical texts, there's always an assumption that when some people get destroyed, other people get destroyed. The same way when Avram is arguing for Sodom to be saved, he doesn't say, oh, just save the righteous people. He says, if there are 10 righteous people, if there are 20 righteous people, will they save the city? Because you can't, they're going to die with the city if the city is destroyed. So are they enough to save the entire city? In the final analysis, God does in fact extract the righteous people and destroy everyone else. But the fact is that from a human point of view, this is not possible. From a human point of view, either everyone's saved or everyone goes. And here at this point in our kind of biblical history, as it were, the biblical worldview, it's changed. Once we're in Shivat Zion, once we're in the return to Zion, we're already through an exile. We're already past Yechezkel, where Yechezkel also kind of sees things this way, that you can just save the righteous. You can just destroy the wicked and save the righteous. They're not going to share, and they're not, even though they're part of a collective, they're not going to share the same fate. So back to yes.
It seems to me that the paradigm of just saving the good people and destroying the wicked, it comes up both in stone, like you mentioned it, and also with Noah. So you would think that idea would already exist.
So the idea is okay, so let me be a little bit clearer. It's not that, oh, the righteous can't be saved. The righteous can be saved. But the general rule is, I'll tell you, and of course, you can argue with me, right? This is an idea that I think, right? That the attitude towards collective punishment and collective consequences in most biblical texts is that this is something that on the one hand is not really just. On the other hand, it's the way the world works. In other words, Avram says to God, he says, will the God of justice not do justice, right? Well, if there's an idea that to do justice, you should not be killing the righteous with the wicked. And yet, the whole line of argument is the righteous will die with the wicked. unless we save the entire city, right? That's his whole argument, right? Because in fact, in the real world, when there's an earthquake, everyone dies. Some people are saved, like in first Isaiah, right? In Rishayahu, it talks about the remnant, right? The remnant, right? There are people who escape. But the fact that they escaped doesn't mean that everyone who died was wicked. Everyone who lives especially in the ancient world, because in this world we live in, there are a lot of ways that a person can kind of save themselves from what happens to other people, because everyone is in their own home and they have their own insurance and they have their own things. But in the ancient world, you were very much part of your city and your land. If your city was in trouble, the chances are things were going to be very, very bad for you, right? It doesn't matter even what side you were on in, let's say, the rebellion. Once the empire comes, they're not necessarily going to know which side you were on, right? So things are not going to be good for you. So because of that reality, when these things are talked about, and again, it's not that only in biblical books we have this. We have it in the Hittite king prayers, where the king is saying, where he's saying to the gods, right? My forefathers sinned, but it wasn't us. Or why should you, because some wicked people sinned, why should you kill all of us? That's not right. That's not just, right? And yet that's what he's worried is happening, right? Because in fact, when bad things happen, they happen to everyone. So there is absolutely the idea that you can save, and as we said, with Sodom, God just goes in, God sends an angel, goes in and saves Lot, right? But in general, the idea is that it is simply a function of the world that people get punished together. If you've got a lot of wicked people, then the righteous people aren't just going to escape. Whereas once we get into Second Temple literature, there's absolutely the expectation that righteous people are going to escape. In other words, the question is there even a possibility? And is this the expectation? We're at this point, we're getting to the expectation that what the apocalyptic age means is that righteous people get good things and wicked people get bad things. Now, note that wasn't the case in what we read in Zechariah. It's not like it's universal, right? When Zechariah was talking about women being raped and half the city going into exile, it doesn't say anything about righteous versus wicked. It's not saying wicked people go into exile, right? This is a bad thing that's going to happen to the city. So you still have this idea of sometimes bad things happen to everyone. And yet you have much more common in later Second Temple literature, where this apocalyptic age is something that everyone's hoping for, because the righteous people are going to get rewarded then, and the wicked people are going to get destroyed. As opposed to, I always quote with Amos, what do you want the day of the Lord for? It's a day of darkness and not light, right? And you think you're going to escape and you won't escape, right? That idea makes sense for Amos, and it makes very much sense for earlier prophets. It makes less sense once you get to the mindset of, no, God, the whole point of this apocalyptic battle or judgment is that it divides between the righteous and the wicked. And again, we still have that mix of sometimes bad things happen to everyone, right? It's not that it's disappeared.
But in general, it seems like things evolve into the situation you usually find in the Second Temple period, where absolute justice, and you'd expect the Messianic era to be absolute justice, in which the righteous survive and the wicked are punished, instead of what the experience was up until this point, where everybody is punished. You'd expect the Messianic era to be defined as something where you have complete total justice.
Now, the truth is that's supposed to be a defining feature, even not in it's a defining feature, but the what bothers people is what especially bothers people is wicked people prospering. Wicked people prospering, it just gets their goats, right? So like what they really want to see is those wicked people getting punished, right? And that's what a lot of people are waiting for in the apocalyptic age, particularly as we get into further later Second Temple literature. So let's just finish with this chapter in Yeshayahu and Isaiah. Ki hineni borei shamayim chadashim ve'eretz chadasha, v'lo tizacharna harishonot v'lo talena alev. Right, and this is kind of the class of what we think of in terms when we think Messianic age, because behold, I am creating a new heaven and a new earth, and the earlier things won't even be remembered. They're not even going to come to mind. Ki im sisu v'gilu adei ad. Asher ani vorei ki hineni vorei et Yerushalayim gila v'amamasos. Because all you're going to do is just going to rejoice forever. You're going to be happy forever because I am for what I am creating, because I'm creating Jerusalem with joy and her nation as a delight. V'galti b'Yerushalayim v'sesti ba'ami v'lo yishama ba'od kol b'chi v'kol zaka. Right? I am going to rejoice in Jerusalem and in my nation, and there will be no more sound of crying and wailing. Lo yeh misham od ul yamim v'zaken asher lo yimale et yamav ki anar ben mea shana yamut v'achote ben mea shana yikulal. Right? There won't be any child or an old person who doesn't live out a complete lifetime, because someone who dies at 100 is going to be a young person, and someone who doesn't reach 100 is going to be thought of as cursed. Uvanu vatim v'yashavu v'natu chramim v'achlu piryam. They're going to build houses and dwell in them. They're going to plant vineyards and eat their fruit. This seems like a very natural thing. Like, this is just plenty, right? Lo yivnu v'acher yashishev, lo yit'u v'acher yochel, ki chimei ha'etz yimei ami u'masei yedehem yivalu v'chirai. They won't build for someone else to live in their house. They won't plant for someone else to eat the fruit, because my people will live as long as trees, and they will outlive the work of their hands. So what that means is, first of all, they won't die and someone else will take it. It also means they're not going to be conquered, right? Because that's the classic way that someone lives in your house and eats your fruit, is if they conquer your home, right? They conquer you and they take over your home. You're in exile. That's not going to happen. Lo yigula rik v'lo yaldula behala ki zera bruchei Adonai hema b'tzetayim itam. They're not going to toil for no reason. They're not going to give birth for children for horror, right? The children will not live through horrible times, because they are going to be a people of seed blessed by God, and so will their children. Before they call, I'll answer. They're still speaking, and they will respond. Note that this is parallel to what we started with. God's like, I was there and you weren't even looking for me. It's the same thing. God's still there, but this time we're looking, and God will already be there. Ze'ev, and here's the classic. Ze'ev v'taleh yir'u ke'echad, v'aryeh kabakar yochal teven, v'nachash afar lachmo lo yareu v'lo yachshchitu b'chol har kodshi amar Adonai. The wolf and the lamb will graze together, and the lion, like the ox, will eat straw, and the serpent will eat earth. It's not going to do nothing evil. They won't do any evil or destroy anything on my holy mountain, says God. So we started with, there's going to be a division between the righteous and the wicked. There's going to be tremendous plenty, which reminds us of the kind of the natural prophecies before, and then the actual. But remember, God created a new heaven and earth. The actual state of nature is going to be different. You're actually going to have animals themselves are going to be at peace. So it's an extension of the peace and plenty that we've seen in other more natural prophecies, are now extended to be an unnatural world of peace and of tremendously long lives. So now we have almost kind of the fleshed out what we're used to thinking of when we think of an apocalyptic Messianic age, where you have this kind of apocalyptic something that's going to divide between the wicked and the righteous, where the wicked get destroyed and the righteous prosper. And then afterwards, this Messianic age of tremendous peace. Note, again, no Messiah. It's God, right? God is doing this. There's no, at least in this chapter, the point is not that there's a king. It's all being done by God. So what we've seen is the different range of prophetic visions of the redemption in this period. We've seen both ideas of just peace and plenty. We've seen ideas of tremendously apocalyptic battle that hits everyone, that's very destructive. But the result is that all the nations recognize God. And we've seen this idea that the battle, rather than one of the nations, is a time when God judges between the wicked and the righteous, destroys the wicked, makes the righteous prosper, and then ushers in another peaceful age. I do want to say, I want to close, and I know we're past the hour, but I do want to close with this idea of, if we talk about what are these visions doing? So on the one hand, the visions of peace and plenty are a promise to a fairly desperate people that are not living in peace and plenty. Whereas the more apocalyptic visions are fixing this idea that is this all there is, right? Is this all there is? And the answer is no. And part of it is also what you mentioned before, was the idea of justice, right? So part of what's going on now also is, how can it be that the wicked prosper and the righteous, one assumes, do not? So that's going to be fixed in this coming age. We need all these things to kind of be fixed with the coming age. The wicked have to be punished. The righteous have to be rewarded. There needs to be, everyone has to recognize God, right? All the nations have to recognize God, but so does the nation of Israel, right? This idea that God says, I've been calling you and you aren't looking. I've been here and you haven't been looking. So it's going to fix that as well. And now we've had an idea, and that's a classic prophetic idea, right? That with the new age, God is going to, as it were, change the heart of Israel, that from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh, right? That Israel will be receptive and look for God. And that's also a classic theme throughout biblical prophecy. And we see this as well here. But without the emphasis, at least in this chapter, without the emphasis on a major internal shift, part of it is simply that the the wicked are all dead, and God has managed to extract from Israel and Judah the righteous people who are looking for him and who serve him. And so, of course, that will continue. So I'll see you next week. Thanks for joining me.